the trauma from that particular experience actually silenced that generation and impacted how they felt about politics. Now, that's about 30 years, which is a whole generation. And then you now have a new generation who are not necessarily affected by what happened in 93 and are now thinking from the ground up with new tools that gives them that sense of agency. Having things like the smartphone, the internet, social media, decentralized payment systems like Bitcoin, all these things give us the tools that gives people the ability to think that, you know what, maybe this time we have a chance.
Welcome back to The Breakdown with me, NLW. It's a daily podcast on macro, Bitcoin, and the big picture power shifts remaking our world. The Breakdown is sponsored by Crypto.com and Nexo.io and produced and distributed by CoinDesk. What's going on, guys? It is Wednesday, November 11th, and today we are diving into the world of Nigeria and African Bitcoin and crypto. And specifically, we're looking at how the recent EndSARS movement has created kind of an inflection point potentially for both economic action in the form of adoption of Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, as well as a larger belief in political power among the younger generations. I'm joined for this conversation first by Akin Sawyerr, who is something of a crypto, DeFi, Bitcoin renaissance man. He's done a huge number of things in this industry. He has a background in international development and management consulting as well, so a really diverse perspective on it. And I'm also joined by Yele Bademosi, who has been on the ground in Nigeria during these protests and who is also the CEO of Bundle Africa, which is a Cash App, Venmo type application for the African markets. Together, these guys help give a context for this EndSARS movement that's bigger than just one issue, that's bigger than just a set of issues, and really helps us understand it in terms of how Nigeria and Africa as a whole is changing. So I hope you enjoy it. All right, gents, thank you so much for joining The Breakdown. I'm really excited for this conversation.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
So let's, I want to do a little bit of frame setting first. I don't want to assume that people who are listening happen to know anything about Africa and Nigeria specifically and what's going on there. So maybe let's have each of you guys introduce yourself. First, I guess, Akin, you've been working on crypto across multiple parts of the African continent and thinking about this kind of broadly. Maybe you could just introduce yourself first and talk about what you've been doing to help people kind of understand the perspective you're coming from.
Yeah, sure. So, Akin Sawyerr, I grew up in Nigeria. I was born in the United States, but I spent most of my life through secondary school, high school in Nigeria, and then moved back to the States to go to college, and have been here since. Most of my professional life was in international development with the IMF. I spent about 15 years working in management consulting with Accenture and Booz Allen Hamilton, mostly in the federal government space. So a lot of federal reg agencies, Homeland Security, that kind of stuff. And then I'd say about 10 years ago, I started looking into Africa a little more directly from a professional standpoint. And I got involved with mobile payments through an investment I made in a company called Splash Mobile Money in Sierra Leone. This was about 12 years ago now. And so that kind of got me into Africa. I was still doing consulting, doing that part-time. And over time, I just sort of slowly got deeper into fintech payments, trying to really understand how that created new opportunities for Africans. And that sort of now got me into crypto because we're looking to solve this remittance problem. Sub-Saharan Africa is the most expensive corridor in the world to move money into. And there's some structural reasons for that. There's some regulatory reasons for that. And so we looked at blockchain and crypto as a potential way to reduce costs, kind of cut out middlemen and just try to make it a more competitive space. And that's how I got into crypto. But one thing led to another. I started looking at governance as a really important aspect of crypto and how these networks are going to be successful over the long term. And so I spent about a year and a half working with Decred over the last couple of years, and have also sort of now migrated to working more in the DeFi space more closely. And I work for BarnBridge, which is a new decentralized synthetics, or I'll call it like a synthetic debt protocol, derivatives protocol. But I also sort of just work across the space, right? So involved with a few other projects in the DeFi space around interoperability, and sort of developing these new money markets and these new financial primitives that I think is sort of the next revolution in finance.
Awesome. That's really, really helpful. And Yele, how about you?
Okay, so I was born in Nigeria, and I was in Nigeria throughout all my life until I was about 14 or 15. Then I moved to the UK, where I was studying medicine before dropping out, because I realized that, what I was interested in, which is Africa's economic development, I felt that, medicine was probably not the best pathway to achieve that. I had just discovered tech, and I transitioned to a career in technology, so learned how to program and design applications. In terms of sort of like more recently, I'm currently the CEO of Bundle. So Bundle is a social payments app for cash and crypto. So think Venmo or Cash App for Africa. We launched about 6 months ago, backed by Binance and some local angel investors. I have about 100,000 registered users. And I'm also the founding partner of a fund called Microtraction that invests in early stage technology businesses, a lot of them in financial services, in mobility, healthcare, and education. And before founding Bundle, I was the director at Binance Labs, where I led investments not just into African projects, but into other global protocols like FIO protocol, but also actively invested in a bunch of other African crypto projects. But what really drew me into crypto was because having done a number of financial or fintech investments, I really felt that we had some, infrastructure challenges that needed to be leapfrogged. And similar to how in Africa, we leapfrogged landlines and went straight into mobile. And you're having places that are having 4G technology already on telephony. I felt that crypto and digital assets and blockchain could potentially be one of these innovations that allow us to build a parallel financial infrastructure from the ground up that made access to quality financial services be independent of your geographical location, which I can touch on later on in the show.
Awesome. Super, super helpful, and such a diverse set of backgrounds for you guys. So I think part of the reason that I wanted to have this conversation now is we've just seen a significant sort of awakening civil action movement in Nigeria that really kind of caught the attention of the rest of the world in EndSARS. And I want to talk about that, obviously, but I want to kind of set up a little bit about what has been going on, or how people should think about the sort of economic and political reality in Nigeria coming into this month, coming into October. And I know it's a impossibly large question, but in terms of just kind of giving people a little bit of like the way to think about key issues, key fault lines, what people are paying attention to, just what the kind of economic and political reality is. How would you kind of describe it before this movement launched this past month?
Aki, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. Yele can kind of give a little more detail since he's on the ground. So the way I kind of think about it is, I'm not to go too far in history, but Africa had sort of been set up as primarily, a subsidy for the rest of the world, right? So you went from colonialism to, even post-independence. Most African countries have been structured in such a way that it was really focused on resource extraction, right? So you look across the African landscape to varying degrees, some worse than others, but most countries basically are set up such that a small ruling elite essentially aligns with foreign interests, right? And those interests are really just aligned around extracting value from the country, right? So however it's done, whether it's through economic policies, whether it's through, destabilizing, democratic processes, whether it's through weakening, political structures that empower the people, Generally, that's basically been the narrative for Africa for the last couple hundred years. And I think now the challenge is, with the advent of the internet, the advent of the proliferation of information, broader education across certain groups of people, more exposure, you're getting a lot more pushback, right? Because information is more readily available, right? And that's now grinding against a system that wants to continue basically oppressing the people, in my view, right? In whatever ways you see that. And so generally we're at a place where, I think people, especially young people, right? When you look at Nigeria, for example, where the average age is like 18 and a half, the majority of people are young, they're looking at a future that doesn't look great. And they're like, look, I probably going to live for the next like 50, 60 years. And the people in power are essentially proliferating policies that do not support a viable life for the majority of Nigerians, right? So you're getting that pushback, and you're getting this sort of environment where bad policies are now like, people are getting angry about lots of things, right? And they now have some power and some ability to voice that, and voice that in a very global way, right? And so I think that's revealing. So they're revealing on both sides, right? It's revealing the fact that young people have access to more information, and more they're pushing back against that. And the powers that be are essentially now, flexing, right, their ability to kind of repress this. And so that's, in my view, sort of like broadly where, we are, right? And it's a question now of what tools the young people have to wield. There's democracy in Nigeria, but how do we engage a little more in that process to essentially take back power? And so I think it's, in my view, that's sort of like where we are at this point.
Thanks, Akin. I think I definitely agree with the sort of broad arguments that Akin raised there. Like you said, Nathaniel, it's a very broad question, right? And the way I like to kind of compare it is what's different between the Occupy Nigeria sort of era, which was in 2012, and now, right? So for me, one of the big things is just the average age of the population, right? In 2012, there were still a definitely younger Nigerian population, but a number of those people were kind of disconnected, right? So at the time, mobile phones were still mainly just traditional feature phones. Smartphones were still expensive. Internet data wasn't cheap. And so even though we still had kind of like similar realities, people still felt somewhat isolated, right? What has really, really changed now is that things, some of the key economic indicators, which I think the most popular one is the Naira to dollar rate, is a lot worse. I'm not sure what it was in 2012, but I know 5 years ago, you'd have gotten like $1 would have been about 200 and maybe 280 Naira. And now $1 is about 450 Naira, right? So in the last kind of like 6 to 8 months, we've seen almost like a 20 to 35% depreciation in the value of Naira to dollar. So that's definitely something that's playing in the minds of people. A lot more Nigerians seem to be trying to immigrate. We're seeing a lot of Canada being very open, in terms of the willingness to take, Africans or Nigerians who are looking for a better opportunity, similar to like the US in the early 1900s. And so a lot of people are really, really disillusioned, right? So there's been this kind of disillusionment, but at the same time, we're still kind of connected through the internet and through social media. So right now you have kind of the popular celebrities and artists and influencers who before 5 years ago, 8 years ago, maybe I had 20 to 50,000 followers on social media, the most popular having 100,000. Today, people are having millions, 7, 10, 15, 20 million followers across all these different social platforms. Number two is that the African diaspora and Africa are a lot more connected. So again, 10 years ago, during Christmas or summer, you wouldn't really have people flying back to Nigeria for holiday, right? But now, people are coming back home and there's a lot more connection. And, this connection has always been there, is a lot tighter. And I think like what has really, really changed is that for the first time, people really felt connected in this idea of like, wow, we want change. And for me personally, the way it felt was almost everybody has had one kind of experience or relationship with the issues that have been raised. So either you knew it or someone else that knew about these particular issues. And that really made people have a very visceral connection to the underlying issues. We all knew deep down that it was bigger than, police brutality or, the economy. I think people just want change, and it's been underlined for a while. The price of fuel has gone up. We still don't have power. I think right now it's very difficult to get access to dollars. So if you went to pay for things online, you wouldn't be able to spend more than $200 a month on your card. So there's been a bunch of this different underlying tensions that's been going on for a while. And I think also 2020 has just been a very unique year with everything going on in the world with COVID. The economic conditions are getting worse. And I think it was just all of these things put together that really, really, ignited what evolved into this EndSARS movement. And I can go into more detail over time, but I think understanding kind of like this context of, how the economy has evolved in the last 10 years, plus the fact that people are a lot more connected. You have smartphones that are cheaper and more readily available, so more people are on social media, and the influencers, the celebrities are all kind of like very conscious and awake about these issues, and all these things kind of like set up this stage for what evolved into the EndSARS movement.
I think it's super, super helpful. So, I mean, you basically have a situation here where you've got these structural economic issues being faced by, multiple generations, but especially the younger generation who's thinking about their future and who have the tools to communicate with one another and kind of have these models of saying that we don't want to stand around and just kind of let the future happen to us. We want to make it a better place, right? And so then let's get maybe into the specific almost the match that lit this particular set of action. So I guess tell us a little bit, Yele, about what SARS is and how the sort of pattern of abuse has come in.
Okay. So SARS stands for Special Anti-Robbery Squad. And they were a police unit that was set up in the, I believe, early 90s to combat things like robbery, which at the time was an extremely notorious form of crime in Nigeria. Essentially, they don't wear uniforms because they're meant to be in plain clothes, so robbers don't really know when they're around. So they're plain clothes, they drive in sort of like unmarked vehicles, and they have kind of like the license to carry firearms in public. Now, what has happened in the last kind of 10 years of 10 to 15 years is that there's been a digitization of cash. It's still kind of not fully prevalent, but a lot of people don't have huge amounts of cash in their houses like they used to in the 90s and in the early 2000s, right? So, with SARS, they still had this kind of like very broad remit, and began to get involved into things that were not really necessarily assigned to them. And over time, they just became a lot more brazen, right? So there were, instances of direct robbery, extortion, kind of like wrongful imprisonment, assault, kidnapping, and almost everybody knows someone that has a SARS experience or has had a SARS experience themselves. And I think during this COVID lockdown, it really felt like it became worse. So me personally, I had my own experience, and I kind of shared that for the first time on Twitter right about when the movement began to really take up steam. So what really kind of pushed or kind of like, set things off was that there was a video of someone in a southern state being assaulted by SARS, and they actually kind of like drove off with the individual's vehicle, and a lot of people just became really upset by that. And even myself, when I kept seeing the stories on social media, and I was like, wow, I really want to share mine. And I shared mine, and it's probably the most engaged, not probably, it is the most engaged tweet I've ever had in my life, almost 1.5 million impressions. And it was just what everyone was talking about. And I think what really supercharged this was because over like a space of a week or two, you could see the level of coordination that was happening in a decentralized manner that made everybody wonder, like, wow, like Nigeria can be so much better. Like, I had never seen anything like it in my life. There were legal representation that was set up across Nigeria in about 24 states. People were donating money to support protesters. There was huge amounts of transparency and accountability. There was so much unison and unity and peace. And, people would clean up from the protest grounds. People were donating, providing water, food, music. Like, it was just like, I felt for the first time, I really felt proud to be Nigerian. It wasn't coming from sports or entertainment. Like, I felt what it meant to have some kind of functioning, like a functioning democratized, I can't even explain it, right? And so it made everyone like, wow, like if we can do all this stuff, if we can allocate funds and get all this stuff done, get people out, like spread the word and get people involved in this movement, like what can Nigeria be? And I think that's kind of like what just supercharged it, right? Like it just went everywhere. And, you wake up and the only thing you could think of is EndSARS. I'm a workaholic, and I know during like those first 3 weeks in October, there was like, I couldn't work on anything else. It was just EndSARS, so maybe like Akin can kind of speak about it from his perspective being, outside of Nigeria at the time. But for somebody who was on the ground, was that protest, I really felt like, wow, like this is the future of like Nigeria. We have the right people to make Nigeria work, and everybody just wants a better Nigeria. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll pipe in on that. I think I can echo a lot of what Yele has said, right? Especially around the aspects of not being able to do anything else, and it's kind of taken over. I mean, same for me. It took over my life for a couple of weeks. I was waking up at 2 a.m. Eastern time, and just engaging. And it was interesting because, like Yele said, we live on crypto Twitter, like I think a lot of folks in crypto, and it's like SARS Twitter just kind of took off, and it was just very easy to kind of engage and connect with people. And, ultimately, it was also this ability to just, not only engage through a platform that at least the Nigerian government didn't have the power to unilaterally shut down, but also the ability to actually move financial value. Like I was home in DC, and I was sending ETH, I was sending Bitcoin, I was calling all my friends who were in the crypto space and tweeting and saying, yeah, send money to the movement. You could see even US celebrities. I think one of the first people I saw tweeting about it fairly early was Yele Bademosi, who, has this anthem for the Black Lives Matter movement. Like he tweeted EndSARS. And so it was this sense of just, not just like Africans in diaspora, but like Black people around the world, like in solidarity. Right. And the feedback loops were really short. Like you could figure out who was saying what, like communication was going through, funding was going through. And like Yele said, like the accountability of how those funds were being spent and dispersed was incredible. Right. So you had, the main group that at least I saw from my end was the Feminist Coalition. And they're basically making daily accounts of what they were doing. We received X, we spent X, right? Like daily on Twitter. Like they had like a financial report every day. At the end of the movement, they did a complete report and, accounted for every dollar. And, the thing I think was a big miscalculation by the Nigerian government was early on into the protest, they shut down the ability for the Feminist Coalition to receive funding through like Nigerian banks and the Nigerian financial infrastructure. And they didn't skip a beat because they just set up a BTC Pay server. And like, it's like, it almost was like, yeah, now we have our own payment rail and no one could touch it. And the fact that all that stuff is on chain, right? You can see that. Like, no one necessarily has to give you an account. Like, you could see like the flows going through. Like, if you need the addresses, right? And it just made it very clear that I think for the first time, a lot of Nigerians, and to put some context too, right? Nigerians in diaspora send back like over $25 billion a year back to Nigeria, and that's primarily from the United States and Europe. Right. So when we think about that, just buying power of that capital, now realizing that they can more directly influence change if we just organize and we get together and like we use systems that, are censorship resistant. We use systems that kind of show good accountability. To me, it was like a watershed moment, right? Because it basically now said that, look, all the tools we need to take back our country and for young people to have a lot more say are there. And by the way, a lot of those tools are outside of the purview of, the folks who kind of run the country, right? Who are basically, not to sort of belittle them, but they're folks who are born in a very different generation. They don't understand the internet, right? They're like a Nigerian guy. Someone said, they should be in the backseat of the car, not driving it. These guys are 60, 70, 80. They're not the future; they're the past. So I think basically it's not just like a dichotomy of, we have these tools, we have this ability, but it's also the fact that the current incumbents don't even understand how to use these tools effectively or the power that these tools have. And I think that gives ultimate power to young people. I think it gives ultimate power to the diaspora that's educated and is, has to, and really deserves a much bigger say in the democratic process in Nigeria, who have been to some extent, minimized. Like so as a person in diaspora, like I can't vote in Nigeria, even though I hold a Nigerian passport and I grew up there. Like I literally would have to go to Nigeria, go to my local government, and sign up there. Like that makes no sense. Like I should be able to have some ability, right, to vote and to cast my vote wherever I am in the world. Like there's no reason why that can happen. Right, so things like that, I think, are now coming to the fore, and I think the younger generation is realizing the power they have, and by the way, too, I think their parents, right, who kind of are in this sort of middle generation where they sort of grew up in a state. I mean, I grew up in a police state through the 80s, right? We had military governments. Right? My parents grew up basically in police state all their lives, and there's a psychological barrier that we broke, where our parent generation, who have been essentially muzzled, right, and never really, growing up, like, my dad was always, and my parents were of an educated class that basically said, you didn't get involved in politics, right? You educated yourself, and you found your way, right? But politics was sort of like the domain of, sort of the class of society that had almost nothing to lose, right? Which I think was, a wrong position to hold, but they're also like, children of their generation, right? And I think that the younger people are not that encumbered, right? And we're now in a position where it's like, no, forget that. Like, and I think parents now are also like in the background, almost like egging people on, because the movement was not just young people. Like there were a lot of like the silent generation that were behind, like supporting this, like Yele said, providing resources, providing food, providing all sorts of support. And even when things eventually blew up with the shootings that happened, and there are a lot of people in my dad's generation that started speaking out and have been more actively speaking out in support of young people that we really haven't seen, right? At least I haven't seen this vocally, right? So this thing is uniting us in a way across even generations now, where people now. Some of the good people in the middle class are now speaking up and saying, all right, enough is enough too. Like, this has gone on too long, right? And so I think that solidarity is really the power that we're wielding now, and I think that we want to kind of push forward.
This episode is brought to you by Crypto.com. the crypto super app that lets you buy, earn, and spend crypto all in one place and earn up to 8.5% per year on your Bitcoin. Download the Crypto.com app now to see the interest rates you could be earning on BTC and more than 20 other coins. Once in the app, you can apply for the Crypto.com Metal Card, which pays you up to 8% cash back instantly on all purchases. Reserve yours in the Crypto.com app today.
Many investors want to be a part of the next bull run. Others seek to build their dream home, finally launch that startup, or fund their education. Try Nexo's instant crypto credit lines and borrow against any major cryptocurrency with no minimum or maximum withdrawal amounts, no fees whatsoever, no credit checks, and flexible repayment. Not to mention the APR starts at just 5.9%. Stay on top of your investment game with Nexo.io. And remember, it's your crypto, your credit, your choice. Get started at Nexo.io.
I've heard this sort of sentiment in other movements too, that it's almost like once the flood is broken on a belief that you can actually exert agency and reclaim some power, it's a genie that's very hard to stick back in the bottle, and it usually takes a younger generation that hasn't totally bought the line of you just don't get engaged in politics to do it. But very often, to your point, their parents come right along as that happens.
Yeah. So I think what is sort of like very interesting with some of the points that Akin raised towards the end was this idea of like the older generation, right? And it actually forced me to do, kind of like personal research. So in the early 90s, about 91 to 93, there were lots of kind of protests during the military regime who wanted to we had sort of like this politician, very famous locally, MK Abiola, who won, a democratically done election, but he wasn't kind of installed as the president. And you had sort of like people who were in universities, my age, protesting, and unfortunately, things didn't go their way, right? And I think like the lessons or the trauma from that particular experience actually silenced, that generation and impacted how they felt about politics. Now it's almost about 30 years, which is a whole generation. And then you now have a new generation who are not necessarily, affected by what happened in 93 and are now thinking, from the ground up with new tools that gives them that sense of agency, right? I keep saying it that, having things like the smartphone, having the internet, having social media, having, decentralized payment systems like Bitcoin, all these things give us the tools that gives people the ability to think that, maybe this time we have a chance. Maybe this time things can be different. And me personally, right, like I actually think that the usefulness of decentralized technologies go beyond just the financial rails itself. I've been in conversations where we are thinking about, how do we scale up, the decentralized coordination that we really, really had in this movement. Like things like DAOs are extremely famous in crypto, but outside of crypto, one really thinks about it. And one of the things that me and Akin, really like to riff off about is this idea of like governance, right? The governance on the blockchain and why he's so passionate about Decred. And, for me, I can't help but just think like, what does the next 5 to 6 years look like? Because a lot of people were introduced to the utility of crypto and Bitcoin for the first time during EndSARS, right? They were learning, how do I buy Bitcoin? How do I send Bitcoin? What is an address? And this is already a country that is, we have the highest kind of Bitcoin per capita in the world because we a lot of people use crypto for a variety of reasons locally already. But this really took Bitcoin even for the mainstream. So I think that, it's going to be really interesting to see how this plays out. Unfortunately, on the 20th of October, we had the military actually shoot and injure and kill some protesters. And I think for a lot of us, like we, if I'm being honest, personally, I felt so down, almost depressed by by that, because I just couldn't believe what happened. You had unarmed protesters wearing the, green, white, green, which is our country's colors, singing the national anthem and raising our flags and being shot out by the military is meant to protect you. And, this was live streamed on Instagram. I had 150,000 people watching it, at around 7:30, 9 p.m. It's probably the largest live stream on Instagram that we've had. And, for a number of us, like, we really felt like, wow, okay, what next, right? It's very clear that we have to take this towards places that, the government or other forces can't exert violence, right? And that for me is the beauty of sort of like governance, the beauty of decentralized technologies, wherein, you're creating alternative avenues for people to coordinate and make decisions and take particular coordinated actions without the government being able to, I guess, enforce or take the kind of action that they did in the last in October. So hopefully, the technology actually plays a huge role in this, but I can't predict what that will look like.
It sounds to me like part of what happened was this technology was used to solve a specific problem, which was the problem of funds that were being donated not getting to the various parts of the sort of decentralized protest movement who they were intended for because of traditional banking infrastructure. So there's a real problem that it's solving. But then people, as they started to interact with it, it's almost a politically liberating force, not just sort of a money technology. It has much bigger implications. Did you see that actually happen as people were kind of introduced to Bitcoin and crypto through that context?
Yeah, I mean, I think, like, to be honest, like, it happened so quickly that, it's probably a lot of that education would happen, as a byproduct of having a problem being solved, right? By the time it was really like, here's this problem, I want to keep donating, this is the way to solve that problem. And to be honest, personally, I felt like, wow, okay, there's still a lot of work to be done. I mean, I built, I run a company called Bundle, and we try to build a product that is as simple as you can for somebody who has never used crypto before. A couple of my investments, like, Bitcoins, Yellow Card, Bitsika, all of these guys, are trying to solve, similar problems as well. But, we still felt that, like, despite people not being as familiar, like the first time users, because we're so motivated to solve or like to just donate, they were able to sort of like go through those hurdles. But now people are like, okay, I'm curious about this, Bitcoin thing. Like, where do I get started? How do I learn more? And so personally, one of the things that, we're working on is kind of content to kind of help this new crypto or novice users to sort of learn more about the technology. But like you said, it's a genie in a bottle that has been let out that can never go back in.
Yeah, I mean, I'll add to that too. I think that, I have friends who bought Bitcoin for the first time, signed up for Coinbase just to send money for the movement, right? And, I think on this end, the consciousness of the fact that, because the diaspora is already in a position where they wanted to participate a lot more and a lot closer in what's going on in Nigeria, right? And the tools were just very not great. Like I talked about remittances early on, like it's historically been expensive and clunky, right, to send money to Nigeria, especially if you're sending money to someone who's unbanked, right, who doesn't have a bank account. It even gets a little more like interesting and challenging. It takes days, many men extracting value, right? All of a sudden, these guys are like spinning up Coinbase accounts, right, because that's an easy sort of first step, and sending money to a Bitcoin address, and the person receives it in seconds or minutes, right? And all of a sudden, it's like, oh, like here's a tool I can use I never really thought about. And ultimately, I think it's important to educate those who have the money, right? So if I'm studying Bitcoin and I'm telling my relatives like Bitcoin is the way you're going to receive cash to pay your rent, or I'm supporting you in some way, then you figure it out, right? Because we want to get those funds. So I think there's a two-way like learning process that's going to start taking place where the diaspora that's sending 25 billion plus home, right, needs to be educated as to ways that not just give you financial sovereignty, but they're cheaper, right? You get more control, right? There's more predictability if you do a peer-to-peer transfer than going through the financial system, going through a middleman with extra costs, and potentially having like your transfers like, seized or stopped by the government, as we've seen, right? So I think people are becoming wise to that. And I think as education grows on both sides, as people get more access and more mainstream access on both ends, PayPal launching crypto, for example, like that's huge, right? Because there are lots of people who already have PayPal accounts, right? And would say, look, I'm not necessarily going to set up a new Coinbase account, but sure, I'll meddle with Bitcoin and Ether on my PayPal account because I know how to use that anyway already. I was really happy to see PayPal saying they're going to invest a lot in education, which I think, like Yele said, is really the big focus, or should be the big focus in the short term, because as people become more aware of and understand these tools and understand why it makes sense, I think you'll see much more and greater adoption, right? And I think that over time, I'm extremely optimistic. I think over time we'll see greater and greater adoption because on the other end, in Nigeria, for example, the vast majority of people are unbanked, right? And the vast majority of people never had access to foreign exchange, right? But Nigeria is a massive trading country, right? And even just from the data I've seen, lots of people are using Bitcoin primarily to settle global transactions because they didn't have access to foreign exchange in the first place. And it's even harder to aggregate enough foreign exchange to run your business predictably, right? And so Bitcoin was really a godsend to a number of businesses. During the last financial downturn in Nigeria, in I think 2014-15, we went through our first recession in 20 years. Dollar dried up because oil prices tanked. The government had led dollars to kind of spend in the system. And the guy on the street who's not connected and doesn't have friends in high places, well, you're out of luck, right? And many businesses really shut down. And those that survived probably found Bitcoin as a way to settle these transactions. And we haven't looked back since, because the financial system that you're stuck within has proven unreliable even in the best times. Why on earth would I now go back to that system that's unpredictable and unreliable when I actually have ultimate control? And I think people always ask this question about volatility, right? And I think even when it was just Bitcoin, right, a lot of these businesses would still use Bitcoin because it was their only hope, right? And so these businesses are high margin businesses, so they could absorb that volatility. But with stablecoin now, I think that's the game changer, right? Because I think it's part of the reason why we're seeing this massive adoption of stablecoins and growth, because in a lot of emerging markets in Africa and across the world, right, people are transacting with them because it's the only way to access foreign exchange, the only way to access some sort of dollar denominated store of value unit of an exchange. And unlike in the US, where the average person doesn't care because your banks work generally, right? It's not that difficult to use the current financial system. For a lot of the rest of the world, it's a very, very different picture, right? And I think that to me, that sets things up for a very, very different future, and in my view, a much faster acceleration and proliferation of crypto as a means of exchange and storing value.
It feels like a pretty historic moment, one that we could look back as pivotal and as an inflection point. And I could talk to you guys about this for hours, but I guess just to kind of wrap up, in terms of the specific movement that just launched, what do you think is next? What are your concerns? And then kind of more broadly, what do you think is important to do next to really take advantage of this moment, both in terms of crypto, certainly, but in terms of broader just political empowerment? And Akin, maybe we can follow up because you were kind of just on that path, and then we'll close with you, Yele.
Yeah, so I think it's just really consolidating around what just happened and actually building more permanent structures that would see things to the end, right? So Yele talked about this idea of DAOs and governance, which we've talked about a lot for the last couple of years. I think we need to set up literally DAO structures that anyone can subscribe to, anyone can get involved with, right? There's a governance process that's robust, that scales, right? So you can't have everyone talking at the same time. So you have to actually delegate power in certain instances. But literally these permanent structures that anyone can subscribe to, whether you're, Nigerian diaspora, or anyone else who's just wants to kind of join the movement and wants to act in solidarity. Because I think that those structures will do a couple of things. One, it'll create just more long-term organization and coordination that I think we're going to need to kind of see this to the end. But I think it'll also sow the seeds for a different way to govern ourselves, right? Part of the challenge in Nigeria, in my view, is the fact that we have mostly centralized coordination, right? So we have a government where the federal government basically is, it's a republic, but the federal government is a lot more powerful than you would have in the US, for example, right? States' rights and all those, most states are beholden to the federal government, right? And I think that, when governance works, when most governance is local, right? Where you can see where your taxes are going to fund your education, right? You can see your politicians living in the same neighborhood you are. And when things are going awry, where they live. They kind of have to live there. I think we need to sort of decentralize governance, move it down more to the people, where they can interact with their local government. And I think that, these tools that we have, leveraging crypto, leveraging, transparent governance, I think it becomes a way, in my view, that we can really solve some of these governance issues that plague us permanently. And there's no reason why we can't leverage crypto platforms to govern ourselves, to fund projects, right? To coordinate around people contributing to the future of the country, right? So for me, I think it's two phases, right? It's the one step of keeping us organized in this movement, but it's also beginning to sort of develop these mature platforms that we could extend to governance wholesale across the country.
Yeah, I think, Akin is definitely along the kind of key line. So essentially, the first thing is protests are more a way to raise awareness around an issue. And the one thing that I can say is that, it definitely got the government's attention. But for true sustained and systemic change, then we really need two things. One is that we need a lot more young people to understand, governance and the democracy and the powers that they do have. But the second thing is actually around coordination itself, right? So, decentralization during the EndSARS movement was its biggest strength and its biggest weakness, right? And it was a strength because, it wasn't really clear who the leader was. It was almost, one of the biggest mantras was this idea of no leaders. And obviously that was a bit confusing to the government or traditional media, because every single past historic one has always had somebody that you could say, okay, here's the leader, here's the main voice, let's speak to that person and everything is fine. While this was it wasn't clear who it was. So the thing is, as that kind of no leaderless movement scales, it becomes difficult to sort of always stay on the same message. So it's how do you then kind of how do you coordinate this decentralized / leaderless movement, and how do you also achieve consensus? And this is where I think, is really exciting some of these conversations, because it's very clear that almost everybody right now keeps coming back to a few things. Everyone knows that technology will play a role to solve some of these problems, but most people don't have the answers. Now, obviously, because of, I guess our proximity to crypto and the industry, I can see potential areas whereby some of these things that we've built, especially in DeFi, could play a huge role, right? So number one is around kind of just fundraising and sort of capital formation on the blockchain. That level of transparency that, Feminist Coalition was showing in terms of the collection of funds and disbursement of funds to those who needed it, every 24 hours could now be real time. And then even kind of getting consensus on things like what particular candidates should we support What particular issues do we want to focus on, as a broader coalition or, a broader group. I think these are kind of like some of the next steps. It's still too early to say that these are things that are already in line, but they're definitely conversations that are happening now. Whether that happens on the blockchain or not, time will tell. But the same way how Bitcoin was sort of the best option to help in as a payment rail for this decentralized movement, I think some of these other things that we've seen around DAOs and distributed governance would also be strong candidates in the future as well.
Awesome. Really, really cool stuff. Well, let's make sure to check back in 6 months or something like that when we've had a more of a chance to see how this all plays out. But I really appreciate you guys both taking some time today to share both your experience with what's been happening as well as just your sense of where things could go from here. So thanks for joining the show. Reflecting on that conversation, the thing I keep coming back to is the power of this new world of digital assets, of non-sovereign financial tools like Bitcoin to actually allow people to do things in political environments where they would not otherwise be able to. This is a situation we just had where there were people in a movement that other people around the world wanted to support and were willing to send money to, but couldn't get that money to the people on the ground because of the compromise of traditional financial rails, which were owned by the government being protested against, or at least controlled by the government being protested against. Bitcoin and other cryptos simply moved around that. In so doing, they introduced a whole new set of people to these technologies, to these money technologies, to these tools of not just money freedom, but political freedom. And that has big implications for the future. It's going to expand how people think about opportunities to use these tools, but it's also going to change how people think about organizing in general. So I think this was a really powerful moment and a demonstrative moment in how Bitcoin and other cryptos can be a tool for global freedom expansion. So that's why I wanted to bring you this show. And I hope you learned a little something on the way. I hope you give these guys a follow and keep paying attention to what they have going on and what they're thinking about. And I appreciate you listening. So until tomorrow, be safe and take care of each other. Peace.